wouldn't think that there would be such a thing as conflict in the church. The words church fight just don't seem to go together. You would think that in church it would be all sweetness and light. But we all know that that is not the case. Yes, there is sweetness and light here, and lots of it. I see every day people with smiles on their faces, happily talking together, people looking out for one another in various ways. Seeing that just brings joy to my heart. But the more intimately involved we become in church, not just this church, but any church, the more we find that there is tension, disagreements, and sometimes even hostilities. Sometimes the conflict is caused by theological differences. And churches across this nation are being torn apart by conflicts between liberals and conservatives. But sometimes it's over more important issues, things such as reaching out to our community, or what we should do about the caring for our children in our community. Important things. But sometimes the conflict is over less important things. The one example, the classic example, is the color of the carpet. Many churches have been divided over the color of carpet. Something that is of less importance. But sometimes conflict is caused by selfishness. People with high control needs. People in high church offices wanting to gain status in the community. One of the books that I'm having to read for class is Clergy Killers, Guidance for Pastors and Congregations Under Attack. This is by Lloyd Reacher. This book was published about 20 years ago, and it's still in print and selling well. I think mostly because seminary professors are requiring us to read it. But that being said, this book addresses the problem of conflict in the church. And I'm not talking about normal conflict. Normal conflict can be a healthy thing and keep the church in a balance. But I'm talking about abnormal or abusive conflict, which has the potential to bring down clergy and to close the doors of churches. Abnormal and abusive conflict is often caused by parishioners, those with personality disorders or mental illness, or those that just have a mean streak. But sometimes the problem or conflict is caused by the pastor themselves. I don't want to make it sound as if churches are always in the middle of trouble and conflict. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. But we need to be prepared to deal with conflict in the church, because it has the potential to pop up when we least expect it. Jesus knew that this would happen, and he had seen it amongst his disciples. You see, in our reading today, our reading from Mark 33, Jesus is sitting in Capernaum with his disciples one day, and he asked them a question. He asked them, "What were you arguing about amongst yourselves on the way?" Can you believe it? Arguing? The disciples were arguing? You bet they were. You know what it's like when someone asks an embarrassing question. Everyone sits quietly. They look at their shoes. They're hoping that no one will call on them. That's what happened to the disciples on that particular day. When Jesus asked them that question, what were you arguing about on the way? His disciples, they didn't answer. They just sat silently, sat on their hands, and looked at their shoes. Mark goes on and tells us more of the story in 9:34, where he explains what's going on. He said that the disciples were silent because they had disputed with one another on the way about who was the greatest. What do you think? Did the disciples know better? Did they know that Jesus wouldn't approve of such talk? I think the answer is absolutely. That's why when Jesus asked them what they had been talking about along the way, they began to sit on their hands and look at their shoes. All of the disciples were hoping to avoid the spotlight. I thought it was interesting that it was difficult for even Peter to say something. Peter was the one that, in the past few weeks, has had an answer for everything. Whenever a situation came up, he was the first to say something. But on this particular situation, this particular day, Peter, like the rest of the disciples, sat in silence and looked at his shoes. I want us to review the story for a moment and see what Jesus' disciples were arguing about was who was the greatest. One would say, I'm the greatest, and the other would say, no, I'm the greatest. And I think that kind of thing happens even in the church. It usually isn't quite that bold-faced, but it does happen. Someone starts thinking that he or she is God's gift to the church and starts shouldering others to the side and begins to insist on doing things their way and starts criticizing others. Unfortunately, this does happen. We could call it selfishness or pig-headedness or even arrogance. Whatever we call it, it has the potential to hurt the church. So let's see how Jesus dealt with his disciples when he caught them arguing about who was the greatest. First of all, and it's especially important, Jesus did not ignore the problem. Jesus confronted his disciples. He popped the bubble and let the bad smell into the room. He asked, what were you arguing among yourselves on the way? The second thing Jesus did is he surfaced the problem in a quiet room where only he and his disciples were present. He didn't embarrass his disciples in public. He did just the opposite. Jesus went out of his way to solve the problem as quietly as possible. So in the quiet room, he asked his disciples, what were you discussing on the way? The third thing that Jesus did is he took corrective action. He didn't say shame on you because he knew that the disciples were ashamed, embarrassed by their behavior. That's why they were sitting in silence. So instead of shaming his disciples, Jesus showed them a better way. In Mark 9:35, he says, if any man wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. And then he went and he got a little child and he set that child on his lap and put his arms around the child, and he said in verse 36 and 37, he said, whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me doesn't receive me, but him who sent me. So you would think that enough was said and the point was made and the problem is solved and the case is closed. The disciples, they had learned their lesson and they were glad to get off so easily. Now I wish I could tell you that the disciples never made the same mistake again, but I can't. If we go over to the book of Luke, he tells the story in his gospel, but he tells it twice. In Luke chapter 9, verse 46, it says, there arose an argument among Jesus' disciples about which one of them was the greatest. Jesus showed them a child and told them that the least of them would become the greatest. And again, they think the problem is solved. But just a few chapters later, in Luke 22, there arose a contention among Jesus' disciples. Which of them was considered to be the greatest? Luke 22:24. So understand that the fix didn't stay fixed. And I think we can learn from that. Someone once said it this way, the price of peace is eternal vigilance. And so it is with conflict in the church. Conflict will keep cropping up, and we will need to keep dealing with it. That's just